Hello. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our lecture of Chris Browning. But before I introduce him, I want to pay some dues in thanking our host, the USC Unberg School, Dean Willow Bay, and Gordon Stables. Also the staff of the Unberg Center here, including Mira Simit, Emily Cavalcanti, Jim Yoder, and James Vasquez, and not last but not least, also the staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this all happen from the Shoah Foundation and the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And there are so many that I can't point out names here. Just to say a few words about the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which is kind of hosting this event, because we have, after the foundation 4 years ago, developed a fellowship program where we bring in junior and senior scholars to work with the testimonies of the Visual History Archive, with the survivor testimonies. And part of this program is the event of today, which brought in Christopher Browning as the, and you can see this here, the 2018 Sara and Asa Shapiro Scholar. This is our most prestigious fellowship we have, and thanks to Mickey Shapiro, who is also here, we are able to host one of the most prominent Holocaust scholars. Before I introduce him a little bit more in detail, I want to hand over to the Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation, Stephen Smith, to say some words.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Stephen Smith, Executive Director of USC Shoah Foundation. Asa and Sara Shapiro. It's been a sad year this year because Asa Shapiro in June 2017 passed away after surviving the Holocaust from a small town called Korets in the Ukraine. Asa Shapiro went on to build his life and his family in Detroit, Michigan. And, you know, from those terrible, terrifying beginnings, Asa Shapiro not only built a successful business and a beautiful family, but at his funeral this year, I believe over 1,000 people from Detroit turned up to say farewell to him and to thank him for his contribution as an individual and a pillar of his community. The first time that we had this lecture, Asa was still alive. He was not able to visit with us, but we're paying tribute to him today in his memory and in his honor with his son Mickey, who's here. Sara is not able to join us. She's getting ready for Passover in Arizona, and she's got a big family event tomorrow. Sara is, I had the privilege of interviewing Sara about 4 or 5 years ago for the USC Shoah Foundation. She'd never given her testimony, even though her son Mickey was on the board and a big supporter of everything that we do, and even though she was very much involved in ensuring that the message and the lessons of the Holocaust were being remembered and taught in her own community, that act of courage was one that was a really tough one for her to be able to do. And so we sat together in her home just a few years ago, and she told her story. Her son Mickey's in town for this lecture, but he's also working with filmmaker Steve Orrit, who's putting together a motion picture about the life of Sara Shapiro. So book your calendars up for next year, because not only will we have this lecture, but in due course there will be a feature film about the life of Sara Shapiro. Mickey, we send her best wishes, we send her love, we send her wishes for Passover, and say that everybody misses her dearly. We can't do the work we do without people to support us, and support doesn't mean that they endow fabulous lectures like this. Support means that people who believe in our mission stand alongside us every single day and give us guidance and advice and direction and friendship. And you know, one of the people is with me and alongside me in the work that I do literally every day as Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation is Mickey Shapiro. And I want to thank you, Mickey, for traveling here today, but I want to thank you most of all for what you do for this organization throughout the year. This is just a moment in our year where we're together to say thank you to you, but I want you to know everybody in this organization at the Shoah Foundation here and around the world where we work is hugely grateful to you for all that you do for us, for your guidance and your support and your financial support too, because that means that we can bring amazing scholarship to our campus here to enrich us, to think about what these lessons mean in our world today, and to go out and work together. In conclusion, I would like to just dig for a second or two into our archive, and as I hand back to Wolf, just to hear for a few moments from Sara Shapiro. If she can't be with us in person today, we're going to hear from her for just a minute from the archive, as she describes the moment her mother told her that she would have to leave the ghetto if she were to survive, from Koretz. Just going to play that clip.
This doctor came to the ghetto and told, and he says, you go tell the people to, if they can run away, they should. And when they came and they told my mother, and she said, well, I made arrangements with these Ukraine people, and I gave them money and gold and whatever they wanted, and if you and your brother will run away, and she said she's gonna take care of you kids. And I said, no, if they're gonna kill you, let them kill me. I'm not going. And I started to cry, and I says, I'm not going without you. And she says, yes, you are. And if she said something, I didn't listen. But when the father said that meant business, he never hit me. He looked at me and he says, you are going. Your mother wants you to go. And she started to pack a few clothes for me. And I says, I'm not taking nothing. And it started to get dark, and my brother and I ran away from the ghetto. This doctor came to the ghetto.
So let me now introduce you to Chris Browning. Many people actually know his name, and so it might be kind of a little bit strange that I have to introduce him, but I think not many people really know how impactful and influential he was for Holocaust studies. So our this year's Sara and Asa Shapiro Scholar in Residence is the Frank Porter Graham Professor Emeritus of History of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He taught at in North Carolina at Chapel Hill from 1999 till 2014, until he retired. Before that, he was teaching for more than 20 years at Pacific Lutheran University. His dissertation, which he finished at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was about the final solution and the German Foreign Office. This study, published in 1978, which is one of his, I think, 9 books now, or maybe already 10, so is kind of not so well known at the books which kind of are coming later, but just recently, a few years ago, there was a big discussion in Germany about the past of the Foreign Office, and during this discussion, which was spearheaded by a commission who really wanted to investigate thoroughly the kind of involvement of the German Foreign Office into the persecution and extermination of the Jews, it kind of was revealed that how important already this first work from Chris Browning was, and how it still stands today as an important contribution. But mostly, people know way beyond academia Chris Browning for his work, Ordinary Men, the Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution in Poland. This is a work which kind of changed the course of the discussion in academia, in history on the Holocaust, looking into why perpetrators are committing crimes, specifically how people become killers during the invasion of the Soviet Union. He introduced a new concept of which kind of focused more on the conditions and the dynamic between these people as influential for the decision-making to participate in the killing. There was a huge controversy evolving later with, it's called the so-called Browning-Goldhagen controversy. I don't want to go into this, but important is that this controversy actually is now a teaching tool at almost any given university in the US and also in Europe, because it really makes students think about what drives people to participate in crimes. And so the kind of very opposite opinions of Goldhagen and Browning in this controversy kind of brings still today to think about the motivation of perpetrators. So later on, he was very important with his publications on general kind of thinking about the decision-making process of the Final Solution with, for example, his book, The Origins of the Final Solution, The Evolution of Nazi Jewish Policy, which was part of the comprehensive history of the Holocaust published by Yad Vashem in Israel. My own path crossed several times with Chris Browning, and it started actually with my PhD on Jewish forced labor, because he had also an interest in forced labor, first in his book, Nazi Policy, Jewish Workers, German Killers, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, but also with the topic of today's lecture, with the forced labor camp he will introduce you to. He is beyond his publications, he is very influential and very important for the development of Holocaust studies. He was a fellow at the USC Holocaust Museum, a senior fellow several times. But he also went much beyond academia, and so he was, for example, a witness in the so-called Holocaust denial trial, Deborah Lipstadt versus Irving, or vice versa, but also already earlier with less public attention at the Erwin Zündel trial. And some describe his testimonies as the most important in these trials. And you may have heard of the Lipstadt trial via the movie Denial, which came out, I think, last year or 2 years ago. He is currently a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. He is on the editorial board of very important publications in Holocaust and Genocide studies, and he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He is currently working on several projects, including also work on former very important, or one of the first actually, prominent Holocaust historians, Raoul Hilberg, and his work on railroads, which he's just kind of revealed to me. So please give a warm welcome to Christopher Browning, and I'm really pleased to have him here.
Thank you. First, many thanks to Stephen Smith and Wolf Gruner for the invitation, and to the Shapiro family for making this event possible. In February 1972, a retired policeman, Walter Becker, stood in a courtroom in Hamburg, Germany, awaiting the verdict of a trial. Becker was in that courtroom because of his role in the German occupation in Poland. He had been born in the late 19th century, had served on both the Eastern and Western fronts in World War I. After the war, had begun his career as a professional policeman. And in 1930, he joined the SPD, the German Social Democrat Party. That meant when the Nazis came to power in 1933, he was suspended from his job. But he apparently made his peace with the Nazis very quickly. He joined the Nazi Party and was reinstated as a policeman. Nonetheless, his various attempts to join the SS to make a more prominent career were continually rejected. By Nazi terms, he was never a very prominent or successful career. He was, in fact, one of these borderline mediocrities that was left in the wake of the very fast risers that were much better known, certainly, by the end of the war. In 1940, he was sent to Poland, to a small industrial town of Starachowice in south-central Poland. If you know the map of Poland, it is just as far south of Radom as Warsaw is north of Radom, so it's south-central Poland. There, he became chief of police, a very modest police station, very few personnel, and was left there for the entire war, while others moved east to the Soviet Union, experienced rapid promotion. Once again, just as his attempts to get into the SS were rejected, any attempts to move up the ladder of the occupation hierarchy were likewise unsuccessful. And he then, at least in his own mind, ended the war, in a sense, in obscurity, was reinstated as a policeman in post-World War II Germany, and only relatively late came to the attention of investigative authorities who began to look into what he had done in Starachowice. And indeed, in his time there, he may have been, in Nazi terms, a non-entity, but of course, for the Jewish population of Wierbrznik, the Jewish town adjacent to Starachowice, he was the master of life and death. And he presided over the liquidation of the Wierbrznik ghetto on October 27, 1942, in which close to 4,000 people were put onto one long 58-car train sent to Treblinka, from which there was not a single survivor. But some 1,600 people from the ghetto were sent into local labor camps, because Starachowice had a blast furnace steel mill and a munitions factory and a lumber yard where they made the crates that they shipped the ammunition and grenades that were produced there. So there were 3 labor camps in Starachowice, to which some 1,600 Jews from the ghetto of Wierbrznik were sent, while the rest of their families were sent off to Treblinka. Later he liquidated the labor camps, put people on the train to Birkenau in late July of 1944 as the Russian army approached. And so he was involved in the liquidation of both the ghetto and the labor camps. And it was for that that he stood trial finally in 1971, 1972. The outcome of that trial, however, was at least I would consider a judicial disaster and disgrace. The judge began reading his verdict by making very clear that of all the kinds of testimony that the judicial system operates with, written, documentary testimonies, circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, and eyewitness testimony, he considered eyewitness testimony to be the weakest and least reliable. And this whole case had been built on eyewitness testimony because some 1,600 Jews had gone into the labor camps in Starachowice. About 600 Jews actually survived the war, and dozens of survivors. Unlike most trials where it was very difficult to locate any witnesses, in this case they had more witnesses than they could possibly use. Dozens of survivors came and testified against Becker. The evidence of his role in commanding and carrying out the liquidation of the ghetto were overwhelming by any standard of common sense, but this was not a common sense trial. As I said, the judge began talking about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. For an eyewitness to be reliable, he must be, quote, disinterested, indifferent, attentive, intelligent, distanced. And he said that none of the Jewish survivors could meet these criteria. They were, in fact, and I quote, all bad witnesses. That's a literal, that comes right out of the judgment. Bad witnesses. He then went on to create a whole series of judicial contortions in which to discredit their testimony further. If you were a middle-aged adult at the trial, you had been a teenager in the camp, and teenagers were too young to know what was going on. They were unreliable at the time they experienced these events. If you were middle-aged when you experienced them and came to the trial as an elderly person, your memory is too frail to be relied upon. So both groups, no matter how old you were, your testimony was thrown out. If you showed any kind of animosity towards the man who had murdered your family, that, of course, disqualified you on the basis of prejudice. And there were, I'm just giving you a few. You have no idea just how many of these contortions were written into this judgment. In the 50, some years I've worked in Holocaust research, and the number of judgments I've seen, this was clearly, in my mind, the most disgraceful miscarriage of justice that I had encountered, with possibly the exception of Karl Streibel, the commander of the Travniki camp, who was also acquitted while he was sending hundreds of people out to guard the death camps and to liquidate ghettos. In any case, it was one of the two worst judgments I'd ever read in my research. And my first reaction to this was anger. I came across this judgment when I was doing research in the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in the little town of Ludwigsburg near Stuttgart. I was looking at all the trials I could find from Poland at that point. And I also at that point came across the indictment of Reserve Police Battalion 101. So I went away from that summer saying there's two books I want to write. One, I want to write about 101, and I want to write about the Starachowice labor camps and Walter Becker. I did, of course, the book that became Ordinary Men first, and then eventually got back to the role of Walter Becker and the Jews of the Wierbrzeg ghetto and the Starachowice labor camps. By the time I returned to the topic, fortunately, anger was not my primary motive. Historians shouldn't be writing out of anger. And increasingly, as I looked into how one could write about this, two issues became increasingly prominent. One was the issue of the labor camps themselves. This was a lacuna in Holocaust historiography. We had lots of work on the major ghettos, Warsaw, Łódź, and so forth. We had work on the major SS concentration camps, like Auschwitz. We had work on the death camps of Operation Reinhardt, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. But factory-owned and factory-created slave labor camps, the aspect of the Holocaust that I might call the free enterprise Holocaust, run by not the SS, but run by the industrial complex of Germany, was something that we knew very little about. Now, when the Holocaust Museum in DC began their project of creating encyclopedias of Nazi sites of internment, they've gotten, the first two volumes are out on the concentration camps. The second two volumes have come out now on the ghettos. But in the end, they had a card file of 42,000 sites of Nazi internment. And it turns out about 30,000 of those are factory labor camps. This is by far the most numerous form of internment in Nazi Germany, and it was a topic about which we knew very little. So for me, increasingly, I was interested in using the case of Starachowice to learn what we could about the dynamic of the factory-owned slave labor camp, where the SS basically is not to be seen, and everything is run, in fact, by the industrialists and their factory managers and their factory security force. And secondly, I increasingly realized that if I was going to do this work, it would have to rely almost entirely on survivor testimony. There were a handful of interviews by the Germans, by post-war German judicial officials of the factory management, but they lied completely. Oh, we had a vague idea there was a labor camp there, but of course we knew nothing about it, and they weren't pushed further. And it turns out German businessmen were much less reluctant about burning their documents than German government officials. The officials may have been in love with their files, but business people had no nostalgia about their written records, and I think they destroyed them much more effectively. the result was that basically anything I was going to learn about this was going to come through the memories of Holocaust survivors who had been interned in one of the 3 labor camps in Starachowice. And this was a challenge. Historians generally like to work, first of all, with contemporary documents. Documents created at the time, whether they be diaries or letters or reports, official government documents, orders that are sent out, but to write history almost entirely based upon the memory of participants that are recorded some years later after the event is something that many Holocaust historians were very reluctant to do. You could write so much from the documents. Why risk going into this business where the problem of traumatized memory would throw a cast of doubt over the materials that you were working with? And so for me, this was going to be, in a sense, an experiment. Could one, in fact, write a history of the Starachowice labor camps that would be accepted as professionally respectable by my colleagues? And I then began to collect these testimonies. In the end, I collected the testimonies of 292 different survivors, many who gave multiple testimonies, which I will talk about in a bit. So I had 292 different people giving one or more post-war accounts of what had happened in the Starachowice, in the Wierbcznik ghetto and in the Starachowice labor camps. These testimonies broke down into 5 groups, and each of these collections of testimonies had its own characteristics, and so it is important to know the difference between the sources. Not all testimonies are collected and recorded in the same way, and one has to be very conscious of the differences between them. The first and smallest group were what we call early testimonies, taken between 1945 and 1948. Now, for some of my colleagues, these early testimonies are weighed much more, are valued much more highly, considered to be pristine before memories begin to fade, when details are still fresh. And there is a great preference for the early testimonies before intervening years bring up issues of changing memory. In my case, however, I had only 11 of these. And in fact, 8 of those 11 were quite perfunctory. They were virtually nothing more than an itinerary. The survivor is interviewed after liberation and says, I was in this camp and then this camp and this camp, and you simply get a list of where they had been interned, and the testimony at best takes a page or 2. Usually they're dictating it to someone else who is taking this down. 3 of these testimonies, however, were the classic early testimonies, very detailed, memory very clear, going into extraordinary detail about things that were still very, very fresh. And certainly those 3 testimonies were extremely important to my study, but you can't write a history of a whole labor complex based upon 3 testimonies. After 1948, virtual silence. Nothing said in the 1950s. Then, when the Germans begin their trials, begin to investigate the Starachowice, that eventually would lead up to the trial of Walter Becker, the next group of testimonies are the records of judicial investigations, German investigators interviewing various survivors all over the world. And in this case, indeed, they did an extraordinary job. They went out to the US, to Canada, to Israel, Australia, hunting down survivors, identifying survivors from Starachowice. And in the end, I had 125 judicial testimonies. And this, it turned out, was very important because they would have a dimension, they would provide a kind of information that would be absent from the others. For the German judicial investigators, they, of course, were trying to locate survivors who could provide evidence that would lead to a conviction of an accused criminal. Now, in Germany after 1960, the only crime for which you could be convicted that was not beyond statute of limitations were what we would call first-degree murder or accessory to first-degree murder. And this had very a high bar to meet that definition. And in fact, you not only had to prove that somebody had done the killing, but you had to prove the mindset of what and with which the killing was done. Was it done out of a base motive, racial hatred, anti-Semitism, or was it done in a particularly gratuitously cruel and deceptive manner? And so each of the investigators talking to survivors would push them for details. First of all, they had to remember the names of Germans involved, then they had to remember the killings they had done, and then they had to remember specifically the ways in which the killings had been carried out, or all of that testimony would not be useful in a German court of law, because you had to prove these killings were done either gratuitously, cruelly, or out of racial hatred. So the focus is very much on coaxing the survivors to recall German names, German deeds in great detail. As I will show later, virtually no other collection of testimony has that particular focus. This would be the group of testimonies out of which I would learn something about the Germans in the camp, and that was because of the needs, the judicial needs of the German interviewers who were talking to the survivors. These were then collected in the 1960s, and the trial, as I said, was in 1971-72. The third group of testimonies really begins in the late 70s and begins to gain momentum in the 1980s. And these were local collections of survivor testimonies done by various groups, mostly starting in the United States. The method by which they were done is what I would call free-form interview. They would have the survivor come, the survivor would be introduced in front of the camera. You would have nothing more than basically a face shot. Then the interviewer would step aside and the survivor would be left to tell his or her story just as he or she wanted to at that moment in time. No questions from the interviewer. It was an unstructured interview. It was a non-interventionist interview. And what it meant, on the one hand, is the survivor was free to tell the story just as he or she wanted to. But often these testimonies were chaotic, that they didn't follow any chronological sequence, that they would digress in ways that people who didn't know something of the background would find hard to follow. But they were told as the survivor recalled and as the survivor wanted to tell the story at that moment. And these collections, the most important of these is in the Fortunoff Archive in Yale. Then the Holocaust Museum began collecting testimonies even before it opened in 1993. And there were other collections of this kind as well. Then, of course, after Schindler's List and Steven Spielberg's interest, we come to the Visual History Archive. Here, the decision was made to have, rather than free-form interviews, to have structured interviews. And so the cadre of interviewers was, in fact, recruited, and a common form of interview was prescribed, that each interview should devote about 20 to 25% of the time on the pre-war period, usually 50–60% of the time on the Holocaust, 20 to 25% of the time on the post-war period. These were to be life stories, not just a story of the Holocaust, but basically the background and the follow-on of what happened after 1945. And that you would get this much broader framing of what had taken place. But also the decision was made that for witnesses giving testimony from a particular place, they would have a standard series of questions they would be asked. So all French Jews would be asked a kind of standard format of questions. Jews from Warsaw would be asked a certain set of questions. And the notion was that you should have a data bank in which you would collect the numerous testimonies about particular topics relevant to the area from which they came. But it also meant that the interviewer finally was to keep the testifier on track, make sure that it was a chronological interview, that they didn't digress, that they progressed in telling their story in an orderly way, that the listener, even if they had no historical background, would be able to understand and could follow fairly easily. And so they quite often broke in and would interrupt the testifier and redirect direct the testimony in ways that would keep it in their minds on track. Now, I began looking at these testimonies really in the very late 1990s, as most of them were taken between 1995 and 2000. Fortunately, people there began supplying me with the very first video cassettes in the late 1990s. I didn't get to look them up streaming on Scream until much later, so most of my earlier first encounters were with the now ancient technology of putting things into my VCR. But in any case, as I would listen to these testimonies, there were times in which I was terribly frustrated. That a survivor would begin to approach a very delicate and difficult topic in an indirect manner. And just as they were getting to a topic I desperately knew where they were going and I wanted to hear, the interviewer would intervene and say, oh, we must get back to the story, and they would haul them back. I just wanted to reach through the screen and strangle the interviewer on the spot. One testimony, I would say, the most appalling one, is when a survivor was explaining his experience in the camp and said that a capo had hit him, had beat him, and the survivor said, "You mean you were struck by another Jew?" And the blood just drained out of the face of the man telling the story. It was very clear that he said, "Who am I talking to? This is nonsense," and he just shut down. I mean, after that, there was just no more testimony. So those were the negative side. But there were also very positive sides. It's important to understand things that came out of this method that the Visual History Archive used that were very important and useful. One, there were some survivors who couldn't tell their own story. And without a series of questions, we would not have their testimonies. But having somebody to prod them and to lead them and encourage them, in fact, you've got testimonies that we otherwise would never have. And there were cases in which parts of their testimony would never have been given if the interviewer had not intervened. For my purposes, the most important case was a survivor who had escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, a harrowing escape, and he spent a long time talking about this, reached the Starachowice labor camps where he sneaked in as a, quote, illegal, and then this was kind of a rest period. And so, not very interesting. And then he's going to be put on the train for Birkenau, and that's where he picks up again. And so we're going to hear about Warsaw and Birkenau. And the interviewer says, well, what about Starachowice? Oh, and then he talked for 40 minutes about the camp. And I had a 40-minute interview about the topic I wanted to learn, which would have never been in the testimony if there hadn't been an interventionist interviewer. So there were both pros and cons to the method that was used. And finally, after 2000, I did 15 personal interviews. 14 of them were with people who I had already seen one or more testimonies that they had given. And the result was that I could tailor each interview to things that I knew they should have had a vantage point to know but had not been included in their prior testimony. My strategy there was to make things as conversational as possible. These were all people who had agreed, of course, to interview ahead of time. Some of them, in fact, contacted me and wanted to be interviewed when they heard I was doing this. And of course, within the Starachowice community, the word spreads very quickly. And I would get calls saying, "Oh, you got to hear my story," and I said, "I'd love to." But the format I used was to be as conversational as possible. Usually it opened with, well, what do you want to know? And I would say, anything you think I should know, anything you want to tell me. And they would start. And then anytime they came close to or tangential to a particular question I had, I would just naturally ask them to kind of expand on that, turn it in that direction to get more information. I didn't want it to seem like an interrogation. I didn't want it to seem like, oh, here are my questions and check them off one by one. I wanted to make it as natural as I could. And I also attempted in each case, as soon as possible, to ask a question that would let them know that I knew a great deal about the topic they were talking about, that we could go to a whole different level. And I remember in the living room of dining room, we were sitting at the table, and of course she was feeding me cookies and coffee. She started the story, and then she broached something, and I said, well, what about the Commandant Kolditz? And she just paused, and her jaw kind of dropped, and says, "You know Kolditz?" And after that, everything went to a whole new level, because now she knew she could talk about things that most people telling the story wouldn't have the background to know what she was talking about. So my strategy was to, one, try to signal that we could, in fact, talk at a very detailed level, and secondly, to make it as just a rolling conversation as I could. I had thought when I started my interviews that this would be kind of a frosting on the cake, and that I would get a few anecdotes that I could add. By the time I finished writing the book, I see, in fact, that they're vastly disproportionate. The amount of material I got out of these 15 people weighed so much more than the first interview that ran about 2 hours. When you, in a sense, can do a second interview based upon the first interview on a topic in which we both knew what we were talking about. That is, she knew she had an interviewer, in this case, that was willing to go into great detail. They could be tremendously fruitful. In the end, I would say, in terms of the kinds of testimonies, I'm glad I had all of these different kinds. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of these kinds of testimonies, and I hope that having judicial testimonies, early testimonies, free-form testimonies, structured testimonies, personal interviews, I could get the advantages of each of these approaches and overcome the disadvantages of each of these. I simply don't believe there is a silver bullet. I don't believe there is a single way, best way in which one gets a survivor interview, that there are advantages and disadvantages to each, and I'm glad that I had multiple collections and could take advantage of all of them. Now, in terms of using these testimonies, there were a number of issues that my colleagues often worried about. For one, some felt clearly that one issue I had to do was, how do you thread that narrow line between neglect on the one hand and uncritical use of testimony on the other? Certainly, we know that if one takes the testimony but doesn't apply critical historical method to it, very unfortunate things can happen. And I think, for instance, the Benjamin Wilkomirski memoirs Fragments, in which he was lionized for writing this book about his his basically infant memories of going through the camps as a 5- or 6-year-old. And he was lionized at the Holocaust Museum and trotted around and with great celebrity, until a Swiss journalist found out that he had been born in Switzerland after the war, and all of this was a fantasy. And of course, for Holocaust deniers, nothing could be more fruitful to them than to be able to discredit a Holocaust testimony. We know, of course, in the case of Ivan Demjanjuk, where he was accused of being Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, even though his Travniki card said he was Ivan Demjanjuk who had been sent to Sobibor. In showing a photo spread to survivors for Fedorenko, who was at Treblinka, 5 survivors said, oh, well, that's Fedorenko, but here's Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, even though the documentary evidence said to the contrary. The OSI, Office of Special Investigations, chose to believe the survivor testimony contrary to the written evidence, stripped him of his citizenship, and extradited him to Israel, where he was tried and convicted and sentenced to death as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. In the intervening period between the trial and his appeal, Soviet archives became increasingly more open, and researchers for the defense found, in fact, KGB interrogations in the Soviet Union that made it very clear that he was, in fact, not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, but Ivan the somewhat less terrible of Sobibor, and he had been convicted under a false identity. He was not the man, and he had not committed the crimes of which he was convicted. The Israeli Supreme Court courageously threw out the verdict and sent him back to the United States, where he eventually was indeed stripped of his citizenship as Ivan the Less Terrible of Sobibor, sent to Germany, where he was convicted for the person whom he was. But again, it was a case where where an uncritical reliance on survivor testimony led to very problematic results. Not to use the testimonies, however, of course, is to leave huge black holes in our research. There are so many topics, particularly the slave labor camps, but one can think about many of the death camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, about which we know what we know almost entirely through survivor testimony. So how one threads that narrow passage, you can't neglect it, you can't use it uncritically, you have to come to it with the full force of historical critical method. But that in turn alarms some. And that they will say these testimonies are very good for the authenticity, the experiential side that they bring to bear, but we should not look at them for factual accuracy. You should sort of learn how it felt and how these events were experienced, but you can't expect survivors to know dates and chronology, and that is putting too high a burden. And some historians use this material basically as kind of the sidebar. That is, you write the history by the documents, and then you bring in, to illuminate the human side of this, you bring in the survivor testimony, and this is what it felt like for the victims. For me, I wanted more than authenticity. I wanted accuracy. I wanted testimony to provide me with enough evidence that I could write an historically accurate history of the Starachowice factory slave labor camps, and that I didn't see these as mutually exclusive. Authenticity and accuracy, in fact, were a double goal that I wanted and was going to pursue. I must say that when I started, I had some expectations that turned out to be false. I had expected that over time, the testimonies would become more homogeneous. Let me put it this way. The Starachowice survivors basically left Europe and went to three major areas. One group went to Canada, mostly around Toronto. One group went to the United States, mostly around New England. And one group went to Israel, mostly around Haifa. So you had three survivor communities that talked among themselves, but except when they got older, the Canadian and American snowbirds would meet in Florida. But for a long period, they basically were self-contained, and they were telling the same stories to each other. And I had thought over time, I would come out with three increasingly divergent memory communities, but that each of those memory communities would become more homogeneous as they kind of agreed on a common collective memory of what they were doing. And secondly, I thought that as time went on, the testimonies would become more bland, that more controversial, more sensitive aspects would be left out. They would want to tell these stories more clearly in a kind of black and white way in which you didn't deal with some of the terribly difficult and sensitive topics, and that as one went on in time, then they would become, in a sense, less nuanced and more bland. I was wrong on both of those expectations. In fact, I found that even though I had testimonies from the early testimonies, the 60s, during judicial testimonies, and most of the others came in the 80s and 90s, and my interviews after 2000, a kind of common core memory remained consistent from beginning to end. On the basic facts, virtually all the survivors agreed, and they agreed in the 60s and in the 90s. They didn't change their story as time went on. They didn't invent a different memory, and that the core memory remained quite stable, and I think provided me with a way of relying upon this core memory, of accepting its factual accuracy, that was very reassuring to me. If I'd had these very divergent accounts, of course, it would have been more difficult. And I would also say my expectation things would become more bland, that survivors would shy away from the more sensitive kinds of topics over time, also proved wrong. In fact, there were key topics that they could only talk about much later. And there were several things that I didn't learn about and people wouldn't talk about really until the very late 80s or the early 90s. One of these is sexual violence to women, or just sex in the camps, to put it, sometimes consensual, sometimes not, sometimes bargained, sometimes, in one case, of course, a horrific case of rape by the commandant of a very attractive young Jewish woman. Early testimonies, this is not mentioned, and it really is only in the later testimonies that women began to talk about the issues of sexuality in the camps, and and particularly to talk about issues of sex and violence, of rape. They're very reluctant to use the word rape. This does not come out until very late. And for whatever reason, somehow they didn't want to associate what had happened to them with the word rape until very late in the telling. A second very kind of sensitive topic that people broached and didn't broach, I should tell, the very late 1980s was revenge killing among the Jews themselves. Starachowice camps, the head of the Jewish camp council was a man named Wilkomirski. No, I'm sorry. That's, of course, the other guy that we just talked about. For whatever reason, I'm just blanking on his name. But well, in any case, the head of the head of the Jewish council, Wilczek, was a notoriously dominant personality. He basically ran the camp with the aid of his family and close friends. Many people who went through a number of camps said the Starachowice camps, in their memory, were the most inegalitarian camp culture they encountered. And it was one of the most corrupt, in the sense that you had to buy anything you wanted, a new job assignment, new this or that, that you had to pay to get it. So Wilczek was a very problematic figure, and when the camp is liquidated in late July of 1944, the prisoners are put on the train to Birkenau, and by the time the train arrives in Birkenau, Wilczek, his son, the camp cook, and his followers have been strangled and killed. And when they get off the train, all the prisoners walk past the piled bodies of Wilczek and his clique, who suffered summary execution, we might say, in the lead train car in which they had ridden, had entered to leave Starachowice. No one would talk about this until very late. This is obviously a very sensitive topic, but it did come out very gradually, and I have no doubt that it happened. But obviously in the 1960s, this was not a topic you talked to German investigators about. And in the early testimonies later, it still was a kind of taboo topic, and only very late did people begin to talk about it. And once it opened up, then I, again, clearly think we have overwhelming evidence that it indeed did happen. So I would say that, as I say, those expectations I had were wrong. Very sensitive issues did come out in the 1990s. The relative stability of the core memory, I think, was confirmed by these testimonies, and that, I think, bolstered my confidence that I could, in fact, proceed. Even then, however, I think it's important to know that when you're dealing with testimony, you're dealing with memory, and memory of an event and the event itself are not the same thing. And in fact, trying to write history from memory is kind of an archaeology. That is, there are layers of memory that one has to go through, in which there is a lot that is going to be deeply buried and never recovered. And I would say that, in fact, I would have sort of four rough categories of layers of memory that are relevant here. The first is what I call repressed memory, and this is, in fact, lost memory. Things that had happened that were so searing, so traumatic, that even the survivors themselves had to repress these events in order to cope and to continue and to survive, that they will never recover. Now, I came to this not through, in fact, any of the survivors, but through an experience of my uncle. My uncle was a missionary in Singapore in 1942. As the Japanese army moved down the Malay Peninsula, he sent his wife and one-year-old child on one of the last boats across the Indian Ocean, not knowing whether it'd be torpedoed or not. I mean, it wasn't a risk-free thing, but consciously deciding that he would stay because he could never come back and be a pastor to his flock after the war if he had not shared the Japanese occupation with them. Well, this, of course, turned out to be a very naive decision. Most of his flock were Chinese, and they were simply left as an occupied. In Japanese mind, they were Asians liberated by the Japanese occupation, while he was an enemy alien thrown into Changi prison, where he spent the rest of the war, 3.5 years, emerged about half his body weight, and barely alive. In any case, he had no memory at the end of the war of having made the decision to stay. He could not have survived 3.5 years if he had been beating himself up every day over the stupidity of the decision he had taken. Repression was a necessary psychological defense to help him cope and to stay alive. The only way he recovered that repressed memory is he could go back to the garden of his house, dig up his diary, and read about what he had done in February of 1942 that he had no memory of whatsoever. Now, most Holocaust survivors could not go back to their gardens and dig up their diaries. And so I'm sure that many of them had events like this that simply they had to erase, they had to repress, they couldn't have gone on, they couldn't have functioned and survived if they had had to deal with the guilt or the second thoughts, recriminations on things that they had done or experienced. A second layer, I would say, is what I call secret memory. These are things the survivor knows but has never told anyone else. And of course, when you read memoirs later, there's usually points at which the survivor will say, and I'm now going to tell you a story I've never told any other human being. And then he will go on to say about how he stole bread from his bunkmate or deserted his family or some other thing that he had done that he simply had been unable to articulate until that point. And so these secret memories remain secret until, of course, the survivor decides to share them. How many remain secret, again, is, of course, something the historian will never know. But we do know that much of this only gradually is unveiled and there are still secret memories out there. A third layer of memory is what I call communal memory. These are memories that people in the same ghetto or the same camp, they all know what happened, but they also tacitly understand that it is a sensitive enough subject that people who were not there and don't understand the context would make false judgments about. For instance, the execution of Wilczek and the camp leadership on the train to Birkenau. This was a taboo subject. Everybody in the community knew this had happened, but everybody tacitly knew you didn't talk about this to outsiders. Because how do you explain Jews killing other Jews in the middle of the Holocaust? And so you simply agree this is off bounds. This is a taboo subject. And again, like secret memories, only much later, occasionally, sometimes do these communal memories then get shared. And the last layer is what I would call public memory. These are the memories, of course, that they do share. These are the memories that they write their memoirs about, that they talk to the camera about, and sometimes secret memories become public, sometimes communal memories become public. Only if one had, I think, a very skilled psychologist perhaps could repressed memories become public. But it is important when we're dealing with this to realize we don't know the whole story and that we get the memories the survivors share with us, but they don't share everything. In some cases, they can't because they themselves, in the case of repressed memory, do not know. There are several other challenges to using the materials, and one of these is what I would call the challenge of collective memory. Now, collective memory is a term historians use for the way in which memory is transformed after an event. That as time passes, the community that holds these memories will tacitly kind of agree to forget selective amnesia and to emphasize other things, to refashion the story to suit the current needs of the time. Collective memory often tells us more about what the community wants to know 30 years later, for instance, than what actually happened 30 years earlier. Now, for me, it turned out the most prominent example of this was in not the memories of the Holocaust years themselves, but the differing memories of the survivors of the pre-war period. For most of the survivors that came to North America, they described Wierzbnik as a very small, rather backward town. The Jewish community was very traditional. They spoke Yiddish. They had celebrated all of the Jewish holidays. They were very religious, very Orthodox. They were very poor. Life was pretty drab. And that there was nothing too much to celebrate it about, except for Jewish customs. And what often comes out is, Poland was a great place for a Jewish life, except for the presence of the Poles. But otherwise, life in Wierzbnik was pretty grim. And it was a very traditional Jewish life. When you get to the Israeli memories of Wierzbnik before 1939, it is a beehive of Zionist activity, that they're all going to Zionist meetings, they're all playing Maccabi soccer and whatever you have, but basically they have remembered the town as an Israeli wants their past to be remembered to be good pre-Sabras before they emigrated, in a sense, to Israel. And the Zionist side comes out far more prominently in their memories of the pre-war years than it does among North American Jews. So here I did have, in fact, two competing collective memories, which I didn't find, as I say, later for the Holocaust experience itself. Another dilemma that one has to be conscious of is what I call incorporated memories. Now, incorporated memories result for no, I'm using this one. Use this one here? Okay, I'll just keep, go ahead, we've clued in here. Incorporated memories come from the difficulty some survivors have in distinguishing between what they experienced themselves and what they learned about later that they incorporate into their own personal experiences. This is particularly problematic with very prominent Holocaust tropes that one sees in the movies, one reads in the prominent memoirs like Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, and the confusion between their own actual experience and what is considered a common Holocaust experience in the post-war representations of the Holocaust is something anybody working in this material must always be conscious of. Now, for me, it was my good fortune, of course, that the Starachowice camps were almost totally unknown, and so the events of Wierzbnik and Starachowice are fairly pristine. No one has seen the Starachowice camps represented in some film. There is only a handful of memoirs about it that nobody has read widely. And so those years, I don't think, suffer from the issue of incorporated memory. But when the camp is liquidated in July of 1944 and the prisoners are put on the train to Birkenau, the arrival in Birkenau must be one of the most iconic moments represented in movies and memoirs and Holocaust and all of the post-war representations of the Holocaust. And of course, what is that common memory? It is that you arrive in the middle of the night, train stops, some people look out through the cracks and see the crematoria fire. You pull up to the ramp, and as dawn breaks, the dogs come, the guards come, they yell, "Rouse, rouse, rouse." You are chased out of the train cars, you form up into columns of men and women, and then you march past an SS doctor who almost always is Dr. Mengele, even though we know he couldn't have worked 24 hours a day, and there were other SS doctors. And he says right, left, and women, children, elderly, and whatever are sent to the gas chambers, and those who are considered potential labor are sent to the labor camp. This is the common procedure for Auschwitz and what almost all people who entered Birkenau experienced. That was not what the Starachowice transport experienced. Nonetheless, a very important proportion of the testimonies cite the iconic common experience. However, and I will argue they are wrong in that, this is incorporated memory for the following reasons. What a majority of the people testify is to an utterly untypical experience. One that nobody, no group of people could have in common invented if they hadn't experienced it in common, because there's nowhere else they could have gotten it from. And this was that the transport was treated as an internal labor transfer from the labor camp in Starachowice to the labor camp in Birkenau. And that they landed at the ramp and they went into quarantine in Birkenau next to the gypsy camp, where they witnessed the liquidation of the gypsy camp the second night after they were there. But there was no selection on the ramp. Now, as I say, one reason I believe that is because it is so atypical, yet more people have that memory than have the common, the common memory. But also, a number of children came into Birkenau. Now, Starachowice was supposed to be a labor camp, but it had become a de facto family camp, and that people were able to hide their children in the camp. Their children went on that transport, and the children are totally quite sure of one thing. The greatest miracle in their life is there was no selection on that ramp, because they wouldn't be alive today if there had been. And they went into the Birkenau camp, and they survived and gave testimony later. So I think, to my mind, there's no question this was an atypical entry into Birkenau, though a significant proportion of the testimonies will tell you otherwise. They will perfectly in good faith look at the camera and describe the common entry into Birkenau as described in Elie Wiesel, as described in Primo Levi, as described in various documentaries, because they have simply incorporated into their memory what everybody else experienced, and somehow to not have experienced that is to make them very unsure of their own memory. So I've gone through all of this trying to basically make two arguments. One is that using survivor testimony has lots of difficulties. It has lots of challenges to the historian. It is problematic evidence. But secondly, and this is the most important one, all historical evidence is problematic in some way or another. We don't have pure, uncontaminated, uncomplicated historical evidence. Anybody who's going to rely only on uncomplicated evidence is not going to be able to write history. So the issue here is not do we use it or not. The issue is how do we use it? Do we understand, yes, there are challenges, what those challenges are, how do we compensate for them, how do we correct for them, how do we bring historical method to them, so that we can in fact write professionally respectable history based on a source base that by necessity is almost entirely based on survivor memories, because to not use those memories is to lose whole areas of the Holocaust that we have no other evidence for. Thank you very much.
So, yeah. Chris, thank you so much for this extremely insightful elaboration of this so important source. So I open now the floor for comments, questions, and here's the first one. Can you also kind of introduce yourself?
My name is Avia Farkas, and my father survived the Holocaust in a labor camp in Hungary, 10936. I have actually two questions. You mentioned that you had 292 interviews from survivors, and that geographically post-war they were 3 areas. And you did say that in Srebrenica there were 3 different separate camps. So my first question is, of your survivor interviews, did you find a certain proportion from each of the 3 camps, and how were each camp's experience different? And the second question is, can you name the corporations that in fact were in charge and ran the camps for their profit, and are they still in existence?
Yeah. Quickly, the first takes a little longer. It was the Braunschweig Steelworks, which was a subsidiary of the Hermann Goering Werke, and of course the Hermann Goering Werke no longer exists, so there is no legal corporate successor to the people that ran the camps during 41, 45. So we have no corporate legal successor. That's why in the Slave Labor Restitution Act in 1999, I think it was, all German corporations were to kick in a certain amount because basically it's so difficult to have a legal succession, and this way you just sort of assessed a general corporate responsibility. Now, in terms of the 3 camps, 2 were run directly by the factory, built those 2 camps for the steelworks and munitions. Later, they were merged into 1 camp. So prisoners who were sent to 2 of the camps later were all moved and consolidated into 1 camp. The 3rd camp was the lumber works, and that's the outlier. The lumber works was run by a German who had been in charge of the Aryanization of a Jewish lumber yard, had the contracts, and he got a separate labor force, and so it was managed differently. It was not the factory security force that ran his camp. Life in his camp was much different. He was one of what they called the decent Germans, where he assured his prisoners nothing would happen to them as long as he was there. You didn't have to have guards because people were trying to get into the camp, not get out. Remember, in Poland by 42, 43, walking the streets is a death warrant. Security is getting into a labor camp. So he didn't have to have guards. No one was trying to get out. And they're all trying to get in, and you had to police the illegals. So it was a very different experience in that camp than the one under the security guard of the factory. They, in the end, are moved to the surviving camp right before they're sent to Birkenau. But I have plenty of testimonies from all 3 camps. So I'm quite confident that I can characterize the differences between the regime in 2 of them and the regime in the very different regime in the lumberyard.
Hi, my name is, Angie. I teach middle school humanities. And a question that came up for me was, and I can think of ideas why, but how would you verbalize that silence of the 1950s as far as testimonies being given or mined at that time?
The silence is one of lack of listeners, not of speakers. That is, among the survivors themselves, they're talking a great deal. But they're talking to themselves because people on the outside aren't particularly wanting to hear this. And it's sort of, get over it, you're now in America, you should now be looking to the future, you should put this past behind you. We are, of course, allying with Germany against Soviet Union in the Cold War, and let bygones be bygones and get on with your life. So there wasn't much interest in hearing the stories. So up until 1948, we had the trials. We had the Nuremberg trial, the American military tribunals, and in the occupied countries, they had trials of people who were extradited for the crimes they had committed in those countries. The trials began to once the Cold War begins, Berlin blockade in '48, the trials begin to end, and interest in them drops, and certainly interest in the general public in North America virtually evaporates. And it is first in Germany in 1958, you had what was called the Tilsit Commando trial in Ulm, where for the first time a German judicial investigator, when he was alerted to the presence of a war criminal in their midst, did the maximum instead of the minimum. That is, he in fact investigated the whole crime complex of the Holocaust in Lithuania, indicted 10 people, convicted 10 people, and this led to the founding of the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes on that model. And it was founded in '58. It began work racing against the statute of limitations. It was already in operation when the Eichmann is captured and sent to Jerusalem, and that's the second great impetus, because the Israelis are collecting evidence everywhere for that trial. So in the '60s, the trial in Germany, there's a huge number of investigations, many of which result in trials in the '60s and '70s. The Eichmann trial, that changes the whole atmosphere, and it is now a topic that people will listen to survivor stories. Particularly the Eichmann trial is turned into a kind of theater of survivor testimony. I mean, he's convicted on the basis of the documents, but at the same time, they told the story of the Holocaust through a whole sequence of carefully selected survivors, so that you got both a judicial conviction and a narrative, a grand narrative based upon the survivors who you could see in the newsreels every day giving their stories. And I think that was very pivotal.
I'm Henry, a Holocaust survivor, a faculty member here at USC since 1963 with a drop-dead memory. Two things. I'm very happy you said what you did, because we don't hear that often. We just say people were too traumatized to tell their story. I never was traumatized to tell my story. However, it is true that the audience was lacking, or the response was. But there's another side to that. Some of it was, I don't want to put you through the experience of having to share your story. And the other point that I want to make is that Roots, the TV series, was very critical in waking up survivors to say, hey, we have a story, a legacy to talk about. And so while the Eichmann trial was going on, there was also the Roots story going on, and that also triggered survivors speaking up and creating survivor groups.
Yes, thank you so much, because I think that second thing is what led to the first videotape testimony projects in the late '70s and the early '80s, which was that third band of testimony I looked at. On the earlier point you made, I would say I have experienced both extremes. People who will children of survivors will tell me their parents never said a word, would not talk about it at all, and others that said we lived the Holocaust 24 hours a day. They couldn't talk about anything else. So it was a very idiosyncratic. Some cases, they had exactly that response. I don't want my children ever to even vicariously have to experience this, much less my neighbors or someone else. So it was a family that lived in silence about the past. But others, they talked about it, all the time.
I'm going to quickly say we have questions coming in from Facebook. So Linda from Facebook says, Linda from Facebook says, do you believe that anyone is capable of committing atrocities?
I would say most people under particular circumstances are capable, but I'd never say everybody. I mean, one thing we learned is that even in the Holocaust, when so many Germans are mobilized and so many other Europeans collaborators are mobilized, there were people who said no and didn't. In my experience, in terms of the survivor testimonies, what I found is the survivors basically talked about the perpetrators in sort of three rough categories. There were the dangerous Germans, the ones that you just stayed away from because they enjoyed killing people. There were the corrupt Germans who you could negotiate with, you could bribe, but you always had to make sure that it's not an equal negotiation. You had to fill their pockets to get some small favor. But this became crucially important in the labor camps, in which bribery becomes a kind of the glue, or I should say the oil that makes the whole system work. And then there's a small group they refer to as the decent Germans. People, foremen, for instance, where if somebody got hurt on the job, you could assign him there and he could rest and push a broom rather than have to meet a quota of, and so forth. So there were small numbers of Germans that survivors, in a situation where they were in contact them day after day, it was vitally important to know who the decent Germans were. I mean, this became life-saving. And it became vitally important to know who the dangerous Germans were, because you make one small step there and you're done. So they differentiated, and as I say, there's the number of, quote, decent Germans is very small, but very important.
Thank you.
Michael Renov, School of Cinematic Arts. You were talking about different forms of memory, and I noticed that when you talked about the rapport that you had with people you interviewed, you said once they realized that you knew a lot about the subject, that you could get more detail. And I want to pose that against not detail, but depth, which I think I take to be part of what you're discussing about repressed memory. So, for example, Dory Laub at Yale for the Fortunoff collection as a trained psychoanalyst was really after depth rather than detail or breadth. And my question to you as a historian is, if someone like Laub, who has a different kind of methodology that maybe allows him to work more with repressed memory, and he talks often about therapeutic value as well, is there historical value where there's therapeutic value? Do you trust repressed memory if it's elicited through the expertise of a psychoanalyst? How do you put those together as a historian?
Yeah. You know, I don't think they're mutually contradictory. I mean, I use the term detail, but I think we did got some depth as well. At least in one case, I'm sure it was very therapeutic. Also, the most emotionally charged interview I had, I'll just say, 14 of these interviews, I had already seen their transcripts, I had already seen their testimonies, and so we could talk of going beyond, both wider and deeper than what they had done. The person I encountered for the first time in the interview had been a child survivor. She had gone into the camps when she was 7 years old. Had been the daughter of one of the members of the Judenrat, and they had actually been able to send their kids into the camp the night before the roundup. And she had then survived the camp, had gone to Israel, had gone to one survivor group, and people pointed at her, there's the daughter of the Judenrat, and she never went to a survivor group, never talked to a survivor after that. And so here we were in 2005, I think it is, and she has talked to no one about this. She has fragmentary memories of a child. So for me, it became a very strange kind of, she was interviewing me and I was interviewing her, that she would offer a fragmentary memory and say, I don't know what this means. What was this riding in the carriage out of the village into the camp in the middle of the night? And I could explain to her that the children of the privileged Jews of the Judenrat were taken into the camp ahead of the roundup, so they wouldn't be sent off to Treblinka. And then she would give another fragment, and I could explain what the context of it was and say, that is a real memory. That makes sense, perfect. She didn't make sense to her. It made perfect sense to me, and I could explain what the sense of it was. But by the time we were done, it was the most exhausting interview emotionally that I've ever had, because she was learning things, I was learning things, and it was an extraordinary interaction. Now, I'm not a trained psychologist, and so I don't pretend but I do think it probably changed her. She now knew that her memories were true. And I assume that's therapeutic, maybe not, maybe damaging. I really don't know, but I hope it was a positive experience. But in terms of repressed memory, if someone like Doris Laub is working on that, if he gets them to remember things, I'm willing to go with that.
Next question was.
Hi.
There's one back.
Well, we have another mic too.
No.
Got it.
Oh.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Rachel. I work on the education team at USC Shoah Foundation. I have a question about the trial. You mentioned that the judge was biased in the trial. Do we know anything about him or his history during the war and the Holocaust? And also, if the person on trial admitted guilt or, what his testimony was in the trial. If the judge thought that the survivors, view and their testimony was false, what was the person on trial's view and his testimony?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Basically, let me answer that in reverse order. Becker's testimony was, first I should say, in the Radom district, there was a very standard procedure. The trains are scheduled by the SS in Radom. They send out a clearing squad to the town where it's to take place, but the man in charge of the liquidation is the local police chief because he knows the train, he knows the area. So every town we had a trial about in Radom, the local police chief is in charge of local arrangements. Becker's testimony was that he had no forewarning this was going to happen. He was going to the ghetto to pick up the cleaning women for his wife, or not his wife, his secretary, sleeping with his secretary. He goes there and he finds these black-shirted Lithuanians are there, and they're rounding up the ghetto. He watches 10 minutes and then goes fishing. The judge says, we have no evidence sufficiently reliable to contradict his story. I mean, this is the most preposterous, transparently false lie you could admit. You should have been embarrassed at how bad the lie was. And the judge did not call him on it. Now, to the judge himself. After the war, one of the dilemmas that the occupation forces, British and Americans, had was the legal profession was so complicitous with the Nazi regime, it was very hard to find judges and lawyers who had not been Nazis. So initially you picked out the few that weren't Nazi Party members, and then for every non-Nazi judge you had to hire 2 or 3, quote, brown judges or prosecutors. Judge Earhart was one of the very first people the British put on the bench because he was not a Nazi Party member. And yet I had this trial in front of me, and at my wife's advice, I Googled him, and he turns out to be in Spiegel because in the 1960s he had a trial about Turkish men who were smuggling, and one of them had a German mistress, and she was there to testify, and he bawled her out in court for Rassenschande. Why are you German women sleeping with Turks? I mean, this is doing this from the high bench in 1965 in democratic Germany. So this is an appalling man, but yet he hadn't been a Nazi Party member, and he had been appointed to the bench very early, and very soon after was promoted to be the head of the entire court system of Hamburg. So he was held in esteem by his colleagues. Well, I said, okay, I'm going to go look and see if we missed something. I went to the microfilms of the Berlin Document Center which were in DC, looked again through the party card files, and he isn't there. And then just on a hunch, I said, well, let me look at the SS officer files. And I looked, and his name appeared. And I cranked up the microfilm, and it turns out to be a virtually empty file, but there were 3 little scraps of paper in that file. The first of them said that there were no papers in this file because they had been shifted to the safe of Himmler's chief of staff. The second said that they had just been returned from the Reichszippanamt. This is the ancestry research office of the Nazi Party. And the third piece of paper said that Earhart's application to the SS had been rejected because of his non-Aryan ancestry. Some Jew had gotten into his family tree and ruined his SS career. And he never forgave him. And so here you had you had Walter Becker, the SS wannabe, and the SS wannabe judge in the same courtroom, and one is acquitting the other.
Thank you.
There was another question?
We asked this question. It's Julie from Facebook, and then we'll pass it to her. Okay, she asks, as a Holocaust scholar, what do you think we must learn from history as we engage in this current climate of the battle for facts and fake news?
That's a very difficult question, and of course we've been dealing with that earlier. I was a witness at the second Aaron Zundel trial in Toronto of a Holocaust denier, and then I was of course a witness in the David Irving, Deborah Lipstadt trial, where we had alternate facts and alternate histories trotted out in each case, and in fact our task there was not to prove the Holocaust had happened. It was much harder than that. It was to prove they knew they were lying when they denied the Holocaust, that they were engaged in historical malpractice, and to prove by what they had written that they were concocting things quite consciously, that they were conscious liars. But that took a trial. It took bringing documents into a courtroom, and it took a legal system which is going to fight to defend facticity. I mean, if courts don't recognize that there are real facts, they can't try anybody. So their whole ethos is towards, in fact, insisting on factuality and on that you can't have alternate histories. One of the defenses of Zundel, the first trial I was at, was a postmodernist defense. Basically, historians have nothing but opinions. There is no such thing as historical fact. There are opinions about history that anybody who reads a document reads it in their own way, that there's no privileged way of reading a document, so his client and I can read the same document and bring to it the same right to interpret it as we do, and none of that settles anything. History is opinion, which is to say history is bunk. And that therefore you can't try anybody for historical malpractice. I argued, in fact, some historical questions can't be settled. Interpretive issues, why did the Roman Empire fall, is not going to be settled by finding some document. But time and place events, was there a massacre of the German labor camps in Lublin district in November of 1943? Were there Einsatzgruppen that swept through the Soviet Union and killed people here, there, and whatever? These are time and place specific events that one, in fact, can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But it took a courtroom to do that. Problem, of course, in politics is that you have no evidentiary referee. And so that people are free, in fact, and are often rewarded for a distortion of facts. And there is no rules of evidence set down by which you adjudicate those. So the current problem we face is one for which we may have had a remedy for Holocaust deniers, but it is not the remedy that's going to deal with the political abuse of facts and the political creation of alternative facts, of fake news, and so forth. That one just has to be an educated citizen. You basically have to take the responsibility of informing yourself and bringing common sense to what we're looking at. But when we live in alternate bubbles, one person's common sense seems to be the other person's nonsense, and that's the polarized world we live in. And I wish I had a silver bullet to solve that problem, but I don't.
So now we have to come to an end. I think this is the last question.
Great, thanks. Amy Carnes, USC Shoah Foundation staff. I wanted to ask kind of a provocative question based on kind of a side point you made about survivors in the later interviews surfacing things that they didn't dare or didn't want to talk about in the earlier interviews. And then I have a simple question too. So basically, I'm wondering what, if anything, this might mean for interviews with perpetrators. Because I think for years it's sort of been like, it's not really worth interviewing them because they're just going to deny everything. We saw the scenes in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, for example, where he kind of chases after Germans with a microphone and practically beats them over the head with it, and they all say the same thing, which is a frustrating experience as a viewer and as a researcher, like you want those answers that you know that they have and they just won't talk about. And so is there some kind of opening perhaps to try to capture things now that might have not been okay to talk about before that they may be willing to talk about now? And then the easy part of the question is, were you able to track down perpetrators? Was it a consideration that maybe you could have talked to people who ran those camps that would have had information that survivors, that would have been perhaps different or would have completed what you heard from survivors?
Okay, to the second question, when I get access to German judicial court records, one of the things I have to promise to do is not use that information to contact families or anybody else, because that's violating German privacy law and invading the privacy of the families. So no, I could not use my research to trace down families and ask, is grandpa still alive? Or, what do you remember of what your dad did? The issue of using perpetrator testimony, of course, Ordinary Men is based upon perpetrator testimony. 210 men from Battalion 101 were interrogated in preparation for the trial. And I found, once again, you have to come at it aware of what you're using. And that obviously here you had not only people who would have normal memory, frailties of normal memory, but had every motive to lie about what they had done in the past. So how do you use testimony by people who are motivated to lie? In the end, these people have been subpoenaed by German investigators, and they're a little more reluctant to totally lie to German officials than they would to an historian. They had no problem lying to me or to Claude Lanzmann, but they do have to be a little more intimidated by a well-informed prosecutor who knows the case and can say bullshit and move on to them, and then press them. What I found out is in a sense, is the following, that I thought the kind of testimonies I got were kind of three bands of testimony. Some were just total lies, like the Becker account of going fishing, so transparently untruthful that I threw it out. I wasn't interested. Some was so graphic, so self-incriminating that nobody would have told that story if it wasn't true. They're not making up evidence to incriminate themselves. The middle band is the most difficult. It's when they're telling some of the truth some of the time, telling truth about what the unit did, but not about their particular individual participation. You can learn an awful lot from that testimony, because they're telling you what the unit did, even if they're not telling you their own story. And in the end, I had a kind of series of rules about using perpetrator testimony. One, is it compatible with the documentary evidence I have elsewhere? Secondly, is it consistent with and does it meet my plausibility test from what I know about the rest of the Holocaust? Is it a counter to what I already know from other sources? Is it against interest? If he's telling me stories that aren't, that are self-incriminating, I'm much more inclined to believe it. If it looks like it's exculpatory, then I'm much more suspicious. Is it particularly vivid? Most of the time, if they're lying, they're giving you a pretty bland, non-specific account, because the more details you go, the more likely you can get caught up. When somebody is giving you a description that is really vivid, it's not likely that he's making that up, and I'm much more likely to believe an account which is filled with detail and visual imagery that he seems to be recalling and running through his mind as he's telling the story. So one can use that testimony, but one has to be very careful. Again, it is problematic evidence, but I wrote a book using almost only that as my source, and I think it can be used and should be used, but it should be used very carefully.
So thank you so much, Chris. This was, I think, for everybody a lot to think about, and I think you also already created a school of kind of convincing people to, kind of traditional historians, to use testimonies. I think your book was very influential in that. Thank you again. I give him a warm applause for this great talk. Thank you. Thank you again all for coming. Thanks, Mickey, for your support, and also the Annenberg School for hosting this event. And if I'm not mistaken, everybody who RSVP'd is now going to the next event, which is the luncheon. Thank you very much.